We have a wonderful event planned today. This webinar, Plastics Revealed, Health Risks, Environmental Impacts, and the Path to Solutions, is being jointly hosted by Public Employees for Environmental Responsibility, or PEER, Beyond Plastics and Oceana. My name is Tim Whitehouse. I'm the Executive Director of Public Employees for Environmental Responsibility. We're a national organization based in Silver Spring, Maryland. We represent government whistleblowers on environmental issues, and we work with government employees and former employees to pressure government agencies to better protect the environment. We have worked for many years addressing plastic issues in national parks and leading efforts to get PFAS out of plastics through litigation and rulemaking. We're delighted to be working with Beyond Plastics and Oceana on this webinar. These are definitely two of the most effective and innovative organizations in the United States and in the world working on the issue of plastics in the environment. Now I'd like to introduce Dr. Maria Brown, the moderator for today's event. Maria is a member of PEER's Board of Directors and a pediatrician based in Baltimore, Maryland. After working for a decade in clinical practice in Baltimore, she now focuses on public health teaching and advocacy on children's health and the environment. She has recently served as president of the Maryland chapter of the American Academy of Pediatrics. Maria?
Thanks so much, Tim, for the introduction. I am really happy to be here and looking forward to the presentations and discussions today on the impacts of plastic on human health and the environment. So just a few housekeeping items to start. The recording of the webinar will be posted on PEER's website after the session. And for the structure of the webinar, we will have all the presentations first, followed by a Q&A session after the presentations. We encourage all of the participants to type your questions into the Q&A for discussion. So this time, I'd like to now welcome and briefly introduce all our speakers. Their complete bios are available on the PEER website. Our first speaker will be Dr. Megan Wolff, who will discuss the public health impact of plastics. Megan is a medical historian by training, now serving as a health policy director at Beyond Plastics. Megan trains volunteers to engage with policymakers and other audiences to take decisive action against plastic pollution. Last year, she served on the Minderoo-Monaco Commission on Plastics and Human Health, compiling a major report to demonstrate the health impacts of plastics, and also teaches a course on the subject at Bennington College. Next up will be Ms. Christy Leavitt, who will speak about government action to reduce plastic pollution. Christy is Oceana's Plastics Campaign Director, overseeing Oceana's U.S. campaign to reduce single-use plastics. For more than 2 decades, Christy has held numerous positions where she has advocated and organized for strong environmental policies at the national, state, and local levels. Prior to joining Oceana, she worked for Environment America as Field Director, Federal Clean Water Advocate, and Partnerships Director. Finally, our third speaker will be Ms. Colleen Teubner, who will discuss the National Park Service and plastics. Colleen is a litigation and policy attorney at PEER. Prior to joining PEER, Colleen was an assistant district attorney for the Suffolk County District Attorney's Office in New York. At PEER, Colleen specializes in litigation involving the Freedom of Information Act, environmental litigation, and in issues involving the National Park Service. Okay, we are now ready to begin with Megan's presentation. Welcome, Megan, and the floor is yours.
Hi, thanks. It's great to be here. Well, as directed, I am the Health Policy Director at Beyond Plastics, and my specialty is plastics and public health. So I'm spending a lot of time looking into the questions on everybody's minds, it seems, which is, what does this all mean for my health? So next slide, please. Well, let's start out with what is this? What does it all mean? The big problem, as we can see it, is that nearly 10 billion tons of plastic have been produced since 1950, which is a lot of plastic, very little of which has ever been recycled, about 9%. In the US, the recycling rate for plastic is about 4 to 5%. So we've got a lot of plastic here. Next slide, please. And it's actually quite recent. It's really only in the 1950s that we start creating plastic at all. But by the time you get out to 2020, you've got that 10 billion tons. And you can see that by 2060, we're on track to triple production, which again, is a lot of plastic. So what is it doing and where are we going to put it? Next slide, please. From a medical perspective and an environmental perspective, actually, one of the biggest problems isn't the plastic that we can see, but the plastic that we can't. Plastic doesn't biodegrade into the environment. It breaks up instead into tiny pieces, which most of you have heard the term microplastic or even nanoplastic. It gets tinier and tinier and tinier until it can be as small as a human blood cell or even smaller in the nanoplastics phase. Next slide, please. Which means that it reaches such tiny proportions that it can be caught up in the hydrologic cycle itself. It evaporates into rain and into snow, and rains and snows back down on every part of the planet. Here we have an image of a microplastic filament on a snowflake, or in the right-hand side, we have uptake in plants, microplastic particles that have been taken up into the vasculature of a wheat plant. All in all, the upshot of this is that everywhere researchers have looked for microplastics, they've basically found them, from the tops of the highest peaks to the bottom of the Marianas Trench. Next slide, please. This is an image of an insect that was, the image was captured in Adirondack State Park in January of last year. This insect is absolutely coated in microplastics. Now, what's curious about this image, aside from the fact of the sheer scope of the microplastics on the animal itself, is that Adirondack State Park is not where you're going to find a lot of plastics manufacturing or disposal. There shouldn't be a lot of plastic in Adirondack State Park. So we look at this as an indication of just how much plastic is caught up in the winds and the waters, how much of a background it is in the environment itself. Next slide, please. So you can be sure that if it's in the water and it's in the air we breathe and it's in the food system, it's in the vasculature of plants, it's in the animals that are slaughtered and brought to table, it's in us. And it's being found in the human body, again, in many of the places that researchers are looking for it, which means that people are wondering what next, where next, and what does it mean? Next slide. Well, in the human body, it means a lot of things. It's been found in human breast milk. It's been found on both sides of the placenta. It's been found in human blood, in human veins, in the intestine, and in human lung. So effectively, we're eating quite a lot of it, passing quite a lot of it, but some of it is being absorbed through the intestine and in the lung and turning up in our bodies. The most recent study, next slide, please, is this one on microplastics and nanoplastics in human arteries. In this study, which was just published in March of this year, physicians who were doing open heart surgery effectively looked at the plaque taken out of human arteries and detected microplastics and nanoplastics in 58% of the subjects they looked at. Of those people, they then followed them forward and found a 450% increased rate of stroke and heart attack in the patients that had microplastics. Now, this is just one study. It does need to be replicated, but it gives us a chance or a sense of just how serious that this could be. It's a striking finding and very worrisome. Next slide, please. Because this is so worrisome, this is a photo of my daughter's rabbits, Lopsy and Noelle. So take a breath in, take a breath out. We're going to try to stay focused as we go through what some of the sequelae of this is going to be. Next slide, please. Well, I had the opportunity just last year to work on a study where 24 investigators internationally started to look at the published literature telling us what the human health impacts of plastic were, from the creation of plastic, its production, its use, and its disposal. And we came to a number of conclusions, and I wanted to just present to you a couple of the main pieces of our findings, what really concerned the authors on this report. By the end of a year, we had looked pretty much everywhere we could look, and we had grown from 24 investigators to 48. The purpose of our research was not just to get a sense of what's out there, but also to document it in a single location where it could be used for study and advocacy as we try to get on top of this problem. Because it became very clear that we have enough data, we have enough information that we need to act. Uncertainty is effectively weaponized at this point. It is time to act. So why is it time to act? Next slide, please. Well, it's time to act because of what plastic is made out of at base. Plastics are made from chemicals and fossil fuels, and it's the chemical point that really concerned the investigators on this study. Next slide, please. In order to take plastic from, say, a measure of petroleum or coal, or in most cases, it's actually natural gas, into maybe a pair of glasses or Legos or my computer keyboard, you need to add a lot of chemical additives. The bonds of the molecule itself, in this slide you can see, they're covalent. They're very, very sturdy. And everywhere you've got an arrow, you've got a very sturdy covalent bond. But the additives that go into giving plastic its features are not very well bonded at all. In fact, in some cases, they're not bonded. And they're all kinds of things. Phthalates, bisphenols, PFAS, brominated flame retardants are all items that you might have heard of. Whether or not you can remember exactly what they do, they're probably under the list of do not eat, do not ingest. But with plastics, we can be ingesting and inhaling these kinds of chemicals all the time because they are the plastic and they leach out of the plastic. Now, more than 16,000 chemicals go into manufacturing plastic, and 3,200 are known as chemicals of concern, meaning that they're carcinogens, they're endocrine disruptors, or they're neurotoxicants. What happens as this molecule, though, moves through the value chain, as it were? Next slide, please. As it moves through, those chemicals migrate or leach out of the plastic. One rule of thumb, of course, is the more energy that you put on the molecule, the more they're going to leach out, the more rapidly. So if you take one thing away from this presentation today, do not microwave any food in plastic. Even if it says microwave safe, what that means is that the plastic itself won't degenerate in the microwave. But it doesn't say anything about the chemicals that are migrating out of the plastic and into the food. Next slide, please. Now, for us on the Minderer report, the thing that most concerned us was, frankly, endocrine disruptors, which are hormone disruptors, and they are quite impactful in very low doses. The endocrine system is a network of glands that create and release hormones. Estrogen, testosterone, melatonin, and insulin are some of the more familiar ones. This network regulates all biological processes in the body, from conception through adulthood and into old age, including the development of the brain and the nervous system, the growth and function of the reproductive system, and metabolism, mood, blood sugar levels, and the immune system, among other things. If your endocrine system doesn't function properly, neither does your body. Just think about diabetics and insulin. Next slide, please. As a result of this connection, we can look at public health data and start to see that much of the chronic disease burden that's growing and is increasing globally is caught up in diseases that have a lot to do with endocrine disruption. Cardiovascular diseases in particular, the top bar, the endocrine system really has a lot to say about the regulation of those diseases. Neurological disorders are way down here, but neoplasms, various cancers, can also be highly endocrine related, especially if they're things like testicular or breast cancer. And we're seeing upticks in all of those. Next slide, please. But those that we were particularly worried about in the Minderer report are, frankly, the youngest. The consequences of endocrine disruptors land most heavily on the very young. And that's because in the early weeks of pregnancy, hormones are guiding everything. We have no other system. So tiny doses of endocrine disruptors can send development in many different directions. Endocrine disruptors can disrupt brain development in particular, leading to lower IQ, ADHD, and autism spectrum disorders. This occurs because of the incredible complexity of how our brains grow. Over the course of pregnancy, neural cells divide and multiply very quickly. And as they're doing so, they form dense networks of connections. Every connection has to be precisely established, and it's all highly interdependent. It's a beautiful and amazing process, but it results in what scientists refer to as the exquisite vulnerability of the very young. It's unparalleled in adults. So if you think you've seen an uptick in neurodevelopmental disorders in recent years, you're not mistaken. The National Survey of Children's Health, for instance, showed a 42% increase in the prevalence of ADHD in the United States from 2003 to 2011. An estimated 1 in 6 children in the US has a neurodevelopmental disorder of some sort, which is about 17% of all children. Next slide, please. So what can we do about this? Well, there are ways that we can try to mitigate our exposure and, for instance, not microwave things in plastic. But frankly, the background levels of microplastics and plastics in general are so high that the most important thing we can do is turn off the plastic tap. There needs to be less plastic, and what is made needs to be made without the same burden of neurotoxins, endocrine disruptors, and other chemicals that are harmful to the human body and to the environment in general. And for this next portion, I'm going to pass it off to my colleagues who can tell us more about how to turn off the plastic tap. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Megan. So informative and so important to emphasize children's vulnerability to plasticizers, just like children's are most vulnerable or uniquely vulnerable to most environmental contaminants. Next up will be Ms. Christy Leavitt, who's going to speak about government action to reduce plastic pollution. The floor is yours.
Hey everyone. Again, I'm Christy Leavitt, Oceana's U.S. Plastics Campaign Director. And as Maria said, I'm going to spend some time talking about government action to reduce plastic pollution. Next slide. Before we get into what's going to work, I want to spend just a little bit of time talking about what isn't going to solve this problem. There are a number of inadequate and false solutions that industry is putting forward, and these include plastic recycling, incineration or the burning of plastic, so-called chemical recycling, shipping all of our plastic waste to other countries, and putting the responsibilities on to consumers. And I'm going to spend some time talking just about two of these in a little more detail. Next slide. As Megan mentioned, only 9% of all the plastic waste ever generated has been recycled. That's it. That's not very much. And the current US rates are even lower. The most recent numbers are that less than 6% of US plastics is recycled. And even if recycling rates are improved, recycling is never going to keep up with the plastic production, which is growing and is expected to triple by mid-century. And we still have all the other problems that Megan was just talking about with plastic, including all those toxic chemicals. Next slide. Consumer responsibility and putting the burdens on consumers is also not going to solve this problem. Consumer good companies are simply putting too much plastic into the market and not offering plastic-free choices to consumers. So even if you want to avoid plastics, you really aren't given a choice when you go to the grocery store or the convenience stores. The shelves are just stocked with products that are packaged in plastics. Next slide. So let's talk about the real solutions to this crisis. The solution to this problem is actually quite straightforward. Companies need to stop producing and using so much plastic and move to non-toxic, reusable, and refillable systems. Most of the companies that produce and use plastics aren't making the change on their own. So that is why we need government policies at all levels, at the national level, state level, and local level. And those policies must require that reduction in production and use of plastics. And in particular, we're focused on unnecessary single-use plastics because those single-use plastics and packaging make up about 40% of the plastic that is produced every year. The good news is we're starting to see progress in that direction, but we really need to hit the accelerator to get more policies in place. Next slide. Many countries have developed national level policies related to single-use plastics. And in fact, the amount of this national level legislation has increased rapidly in the last decade as awareness of plastic pollution has become more widespread. More than 90 countries around the world have passed national level policies to reduce single-use plastics. Many of those are bans on plastic bags or fees on plastic bags, but a good handful of countries have gone even farther, phasing out multiple types of single-use plastics or putting in place other policies that reduce the production or use of plastics and promote reuse and refill. For example, next slide. In 2021, Chile passed what is arguably the most comprehensive national single-use plastic foodware ban in the world. It was developed in coordination with my colleagues at Oceana, Chile. And what the law does is it prohibits restaurants and other eating establishments from using plastic cups, plates, trays, cutlery, and other foodware. So it gets rid of those single-use plastics, and it mandates the use of reusable products for all dine-in eating. So it's dealing with restaurants and other eating establishments, but it goes a step farther than that. And it requires all supermarkets, grocery stores, and convenience stores to sell and receive reusable beverage bottles. and it requires shelf space to be used for those reusable beverage bottles. Other countries and regions around the world, including in Peru and Canada and the EU, have passed policies addressing multiple types of plastic. Next slide. So that gets us to the US. The US plays a really significant role in the global plastic pollution problem. We both produce significant amounts of plastics and we create a lot of plastic waste. In fact, the US generates more plastic waste than any other country, according to a 2020 study. Despite this, the US does not yet have national level policies reducing the production and use of single-use plastics. In the US, there is some good news, and that's really that cities and states have been leading the push for plastic reduction policies. Next slide. Many local governments have taken action by passing policies that limit the sale, distribution, or use of unnecessary single-use plastics. And these types of policies take on plastic bags, extended polystyrene or plastic foam foodware, what many of us would refer to as styrofoam, those styrofoam cups, plastic straws, and balloon releases. And this is making an impact. More than 450 cities and counties around the country have passed plastic bag legislation, and more than 200 cities have passed regulations limiting that expanded polystyrene foam. And this includes cities, small cities like Miami Shores in this picture, to some of the country's largest cities like New York City and Los Angeles. Next slide. States are also passing policies. For example, in Washington State, Governor Jay Inslee and advocates and legislators in this photo were at a bill signing for a law that bans expanded polystyrene foam foodware, packing materials, which we call packing peanuts, and foam coolers, as well as it made accessory food serviceware like utensils available only by request. Now, this bill was passed a few years ago, but highlighting it here because part of the bill, the ban on plastic foam foodware and packing peanuts, went into effect on June 1st of this year, so just earlier this month. Next slide. So this map highlights some of the states that have passed policies to regulate single-use plastics. All of the green states have passed those policies. So 13 states plus Washington, D.C. and all of Hawaii's populated counties have passed policies to either reduce plastic bags and or phase out expanded polystyrene foam foodware. And in addition, there's several states that have worked on and passed more comprehensive source reduction approaches, like California, which passed legislation 2 years ago that set reductions for all plastic packaging and foodware. Illinois and Massachusetts are also highlighted on this because while they don't have statewide policies in place yet, they have either through legislation or through policies from their governor, other government reductions in single-use plastics. So for example, last fall, the governor of Massachusetts issued an executive order to ban single-use plastic beverage bottles at state agencies. Next slide. That brings us then to the federal level. At the national level, we don't have any laws on the book yet around single-use plastic reductions or plastic reduction, but we have growing momentum in Congress to address this issue. Let me tell you about a few of the bills that have been introduced so far. First is the Break Free from Plastic Pollution Act. This is led by Senator Merkley from Oregon and Representative Huffman from California. And the Break Free from Plastic Pollution Act will continue the momentum I've been talking about that's been initiated by cities and counties and states across the US. It would do this by phasing out unnecessary single-use plastics. It would also put a pause on new and expanded plastic production facilities, really protecting those fence line communities that live right next to those facilities. Would encourage a shift to reusable and refillable alternatives, and it would limit the amount of plastic waste being shipped to other countries. And it would ensure plastic producers are responsible for their waste. It also does a handful of other things, but those are some of the key things that the Break Free from Plastic Pollution Act does. The next three bills I want to mention are all pieces of the Break Free from Plastic Pollution Act that have been introduced as standalone bills. First is called Farewell to Foam. This bill is following the leads of states like Washington that pass limits on plastic foam, and this bill will phase out the sale and distribution of plastic foam foodware, packing peanuts, and single-use coolers. The Protecting Communities from Plastic Acts address the harmful environmental justice impacts of the growing fossil fuel sector by establishing stricter rules on petrochemical and plastic plants to really safeguard public health. It also sets nationwide targets for plastic source reduction and reuse in packaging and food service. Next bill is a Plastic Pellet-Free Waters Act. And what this bill would do, it would require the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency to use its authority under the Clean Water Act to prohibit the discharge of plastic pellets, which are tiny things that are also called nurdles, and other pre-production plastic, stop those from being discharged into waterways from both facilities and other sources. So those three bills, Farewell to Foam, Protecting Communities from Plastic Act, Plastic Pellet-Free Waters, are also built into the Break Free from Plastic Pollution Act. The last bill on this list is called the Reducing Waste in National Parks Act. You'll hear more about this bill from Colleen in the next presentation. So that's what Congress has going on. And then there's also the Biden administration. The Biden administration can take significant action to reduce plastic pollution. So far, the administration has taken some steps in that direction, some of which Colleen's going to talk about, but there's a lot more that the administration could do and should do. Next slide. People around the US really care about this issue. Multiple polls have shown significant concern about the problem and support for strong action. Oceana has done a couple of polls over the last few years, and we found, as this slide shows, that 8 in 10 registered voters support policies that reduce single-use plastics. This is strong bipartisan support, and it's true for national level action as well as state and local policies. Next slide. And 82% of American voters, again, this is bipartisan, 82% of American voters support reducing the federal government's use of single-use plastic. So lots of support for action, both in policies that regulate what's happening around the country, as well as the federal government's own policies. Next slide. Thank you, and I'll pass this over to Colleen.
Thank you so much, Christy, on that informative discussion of regulatory frameworks and what can happen when things actually work and are effective at the solution at the policy level. Next up will be Colleen, who's going to discuss some challenges with plastics in the National Park Service. So the floor is all yours, Colleen.
Thank you, Maria, and thank you all for joining us today. My name is Colleen Teubner. I'm a staff attorney with PEER, and I'm here to talk about reducing and eliminating plastics pollution in our national parks. As we've heard in the previous presentations, immediate action is needed to tackle the growing plastics crisis. Reducing plastics pollution on public lands is a good example of how the federal government is currently engaging on this issue. PEER has advocated for the reduction of plastics in national parks for years, since current and former National Park Service employees have repeatedly expressed concern about how plastics pollution impacts park wildlife, ecosystems, and visitor experience. With that said, I'm going to begin by reviewing past efforts to eliminate single-use plastics in parks. Then I'll explain the National Park Service's current mandate and strategy. And finally, I'll discuss how PEER is encouraging transparency, elevating voices, and engaging in advocacy. Next slide. Efforts to eliminate the sale of single-use plastics in national parks first began almost 15 years ago. In 2010, Grand Canyon National Park ordered its concessionaires to cease the sale of individual-sized plastic bottles. At the time, plastic bottles represented nearly 1/3 of all waste in the park, and major investments had been made to provide ample water filling stations. In 2011, PEER obtained documents from a Freedom of Information Act, or FOIA lawsuit, that revealed how Coca-Cola intervened to persuade the then National Park Service director to prevent Grand Canyon from finalizing the bottle ban. Coca-Cola's lobbying efforts delayed the implementation of the ban and showed the influence of the plastic industry in national parks. Ultimately, the publicity induced the National Park Service to allow Grand Canyon's ban to take place and to institute a process for other parks to follow suit. Eventually, 23 parks joined Grand Canyon in ending the sale of plastic water bottles. While the plastic bottle ban was in effect from 2012 to 2016, Grand Canyon made significant strides in reducing plastic waste. The park reduced its total waste by 20% and cut the amount of recycling it had to haul by 30%, significantly reducing the environmental impact of waste in the park and saving taxpayer money. This experience was replicated across the other parks with bottle bans. All told, the 23 plastic-free, bottle-free parks prevented the disposal of 2 million plastic bottles per year. However, in 2017, the bottle ban was discarded from all national parks. According to records obtained by PEER in 2018, the agency undertook no examination of the policy's effects, and its leadership failed to consult with any of the 24 parks with bottle bans. As a result, Grand Canyon and the other parks experienced an increase in plastic bottle pollution. Next slide. With the change of administration came a change in policy. On June 8, 2022, Secretary Haaland issued Secretary's Order 3407, which aims to reduce the procurement, sale, packaging, and distribution of single-use plastic products with the goal of phasing them all out on department-managed lands by 2032. Secretary's Order 3407 is part of the implementation of President Biden's Executive Order 14057, which calls for federal agencies to take action to reduce and phase out the procurement of single-use plastics products to the maximum extent practicable. A key requirement of the Secretary's Order is for all bureaus and offices within the department to have sustainable procurement plans that support the goals of the Executive Order, including specific approaches and schedules to phase out single-use plastic products by the end of 2032. Since the Secretary's Order was announced, PEER has been advocating for a swifter timeline for implementation. Together with Beyond Plastics and Green Latinos, PEER launched a 2 Not 10 campaign to urge the Department and National Park Service to expedite its timeline to 2 years instead of 10. Additionally, PEER has attended meetings with the National Park Service to offer advice and support for implementing the order. Next slide, please. On September 28, 2023, the National Park Service unveiled its Sustainable Procurement Plan. The plan consists of 9 steps for implementation spread over a 10-year period. As you can see here, the first step is to define the scope and exemptions, followed by data collection, analyzing alternatives, planning and prioritizing the approach, developing tools and resources, funding the work, and implementing the plan. Once the plan is implemented, the National Park Service will then conduct outreach and education to shift public behavior. Finally, the National Park Service will measure data and report on its findings. While these steps may seem sufficient on paper, on further examination, the plan devotes the next 2 years to policy development, with no significant implementation set to begin until 5 years out. It also allows individual parks to continue executing new multi-year concessions contracts for concession sales of disposable plastic water bottles to visitors. And the plan would limit individual parks from moving faster, since any park-specific plastic use reductions would require Washington office approval. Additionally, while these broader policy goals are admirable, it is ultimately up to the individual park superintendents to implement them on the ground. Because of the power superintendents possess throughout the process, we must ensure that superintendents support the effort to eliminate plastics and be held accountable for goal implementation. Next slide, please. In order to get a better idea of how individual parks are currently addressing sustainability and waste issues, PEER submitted FOIA requests to every regional National Park Service office. In these requests, PEER asked for any park sustainability plan, any park waste audits and waste management plans, any environmental conditions and requirements in concessions contracts, and any park efforts to reduce the procurement, sale, and distribution of single-use plastics products and packaging by the National Park Service, concessionaires, cooperating associations, and partners. While we are still waiting on responses from multiple regions, some have supplied us with production. Next slide, please. For example, Muir Woods adopted an exemplary approach to eliminating single-use plastics. In Muir Woods, water may only be sold in reusable or recyclable aluminum bottles. Plastic bottles are prohibited. Specialty beverages may only be sold in aluminum cans or compostable cardboard containers, and the concessionaire provides a water bottle filling station. Next slide, please. PEER is also cultivating relationships with current and former National Park Service employees who have firsthand knowledge and insight into their park sustainability policies and culture. So far, one of the biggest takeaways from these interviews is that educating the public about the negative impacts of single-use plastics is the key to future success. Also, if anyone watching this webinar is a current or former member of the National Park Service, and if you have thoughts you'd like to share with me, I'd welcome connecting with you offline and hearing your input. Next slide, please. To ensure that these National Park Service employee voices are heard, PEER engages in advocacy efforts to elevate their views. Last year, PEER joined the Break Free from Plastic Coalition to encourage representatives and senators to support several pieces of plastics legislation, including the Reducing Waste in National Parks Act, which is sponsored by Senator Merkley and Representative Quigley. The bill would mandate that the National Park Service develop a program to eliminate the sale of single-use plastics in national parks no later than 180 days after the bill would be passed. We were able to advocate and educate lawmakers about the dangers of plastics pollution and why they should care about waste in our national parks. I'm happy to say I'll be joining the Break Free from Plastics Coalition on the Hill again later this week. Next slide, please. So, what can we take away from federal efforts to reduce and eliminate the use of single-use plastics? First, mandates with specific requirements, not just goals, should be required. The National Park Service has a history of changing its policy on single-use plastics. These changes are typically motivated by political pressure from industry. So mandates can help ensure that action will be taken. Next, there is a dire need for urgency and action. The sooner the National Park Service eliminates the procurement, sale, and distribution of single-use plastics, the better. Right now, the timeline is too drawn out. Speeding up the timeline will reduce waste and the burden on taxpayers to pay for the removal of said waste. Additionally, it will be more difficult to reverse the policy once it's in place. Next, accountability is necessary to guarantee action. As I mentioned earlier, superintendents hold a lot of power when it comes to ensuring broader policy goals are implemented. One way to hold superintendents accountable is to put implementation in their performance reviews. We also need transparency. The sustainability plans, audits, and contracts we submitted FOIA requests for should be published online. This way, the public will be informed about ongoing and future efforts to comply with policy mandates and hold the agency accountable for delays. Finally, education is key. Through education, we can build support for the necessity of change, both politically and on the consumer level. However, the burden to drive change cannot fall on the consumers alone because of the complexity of the issues and the power of the industry. I encourage you all to keep these takeaways in mind and to take action. Write letters, call, or meet with your congressional representatives and senators and tell them how important the elimination of single-use plastics is to you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Colleen, for that fantastic presentation and not discussing all the multifaceted challenges that exist in just one federal agency for reducing the use of plastics, particularly in an agency which should be leading by example. So fantastic. So now we'd like to open up the Q&A. I see that there already are several questions in here, some of which have been answered, but I think we'll start by trying to summarize some of the ones that Megan's answered with, it seems like there were some concerns on sort of like, how do we know what plastic, is, which numbers of the plastic, if there's, identifying numbers there, and, concerns about the leaching of plastics into items that we use, like water bottles or plastic utensils. So maybe Megan, you could just start by addressing that, would be awesome.
Well, how do we tell if something is plastic? Was that
I think so. Yeah. I mean, because, some things might not appear.
I guess, I started thinking about this as I myself was moving away from plastic packaging because I was learning about chemical migration. And literally speaking, I walk through the supermarket now tapping on things that look like they might be glass, but could be plastic. There are some very, very good, interlopers there. But it's sort of the feel test and the sound test. You might be able to see on it whether it says it's plastic. Certainly if it has a chasing arrow with a number in it, that's a plastic resin code. It does not mean that it's recyclable, but it does mean it's got a resin code, so it's a plastic resin.
Okay, I mean, I suppose there could be clothing and other items that we can't be sure if they're made of plastics. I'm not sure if that's, one thing that the person who asked the question meant, but thank you. And then in terms of sort of reducing exposure from plastics, maybe is there, a website or place that people could go to for advice on reducing exposures from, say, microwaving plastics, which plastics with which numbers might be the ones to avoid that tell you that something has BPA or doesn't have BPA and that kind of thing.
Yeah, ultimately, you want to avoid all of them, frankly, and you can't because the background levels are so high. But you can make, certain choices as a consumer. My favorite website for this is actually called the Million Marker Group, and they exist for different reasons. They actually will tell you about chemicals in your body. So they do a bio essay, but they have a section on their site for products that they find have lower chemical burdens. And that is one of the very few that I find to be quite sincere and genuine and based on true research rather than greenwashing.
Thank you. Okay, so digging into some other questions. One question was on sort of bipartisan nature of current federal legislation. And so one attendee wanted to know if any of the current federal legislation was co-sponsored by Republican congressmen or senators.
Can answer that. I'll say two things about this. One, the Plastic Pellet-Free Waters Act is a bipartisan bill. Representative Brian Fitzpatrick from Pennsylvania, who's a Republican, has signed on as a co-sponsor of that bill. And we know that as we've been talking to other offices, there's other Republicans who are interested in that issue as well. So that's one thing I'll say. And then I'll also say that on the state level, many bills that have passed through state legislatures have been very bipartisan and passing with overwhelmingly support from both parties. That includes, I can't remember actually back to the Washington bill, but recent bills, and the California bill that I mentioned passed with overwhelming bipartisan support. A recent bill in Florida that just deals with balloon releases was led by Republicans and passed with strong bipartisan support through the state legislature. So there is not only from the public, as I showed from the polling, but also on the state level from legislators, there's good bipartisan support, and we need more of that on the federal level. But for the specific question, the Plastic Pellet-Free Waters Act is currently bipartisan.
Thank you. Then it looks like we've got two questions about synthetic turf. Sort of the first was on regulation of turf fields next to wetlands, and then sort of one general question about just this sort of overwhelming number of turf fields that exist in the US that shed microplastics, and sort of what are we doing about it? I don't know if anybody can speak to those questions.
There's not a lot of legislative action going on for synthetic turf right now. There are a few places where states are trying to put in moratoriums. They're not moving very fast. They have an enormous amount of industry opposition. So, I'd say that this movement's in its infancy.
I'll also quickly plug my colleague Kyla Bennett. She works a lot on artificial turf issues, and she also will speak at, for example, more local government or school boards who are thinking about installing artificial turf, and explain the dangers and why they shouldn't opt for that choice.
Okay, great. So another question about the food industry and personal care products industries, and what kind of sort of investments are being made into alternatives for packaging, packaging that's made of plastics, and what could we do better about in that way?
There's a lot more work. Oh, go ahead, Maggie. You can
Go
start,
ahead.
and I was going to say there's a lot. Pardon me, I got something in my eye. There's a lot more that needs to be done in this area, and Megan will share some of the things that are going on. But the thing that I'll add here is that where we really need more investment is in reuse and refill. So it's a little bit like going back to what our parents or grandparents might have experienced, where you buy the product, you take the bottle or container home, use whatever the product is, whether that's your milk or your peanut butter or some other product, use it and return it, and it can be washed and then refilled again. So we need more of that. And some companies are starting to experiment a bit, but it needs to be expanded broadly. One of the ways that people are probably most familiar with this would be around drinks. So whether that's a milk bottle or a soda bottle that could be washed and refilled. But Megan can tell us some more about other things that are going on.
Well, strong agree with you, Christy. Basically, there is R&D and a lot of it into what are presumed to be alternative materials. But at the end of the day, most of those materials still wind up having a pretty high chemical burden in order to make the original thing from, if it's a mushroom or seaweed, to make it do all of the things that plastic is supposed to do. So we really don't need new materials to end a lot of the plastics pollution crisis. The materials that we had were working: glass, cardboard, aluminum. They all had reusability, they had refillability, or they were actually biodegradable in ways that plastic just isn't. So moving to a reuse economy really is the fastest and most robust of the answers. And we really don't have time to dither, given how much plastic is being produced, how quickly, and what its impacts are. We need to move now.
Right. Okay. Thank you. Another question directed for Colleen, to talk more about how the plastic ban got discarded in 2017.
So in 2017, we did have a change in administration. So with the Trump administration coming in, they wanted to abandon that Obama era policy. So unfortunately, that's how the plastic bottle ban got discarded.
Okay. Another participant asks, with regard to potential dangers of micro and nanoplastics, are some plastic types kind of more dangerous than others? I don't know if Megan, you want to address that one.
Yes. Anything that's PVC, vinyl chloride is polyvinyl chloride, and vinyl chloride is carcinogenic. That's been known since the 1970s. So currently, actually, there's a movement afoot to ban vinyl chloride because it is definitively dangerous. Also, expanded polystyrene. Styrene is another human carcinogen, or at least it's well linked with cancer. So that's another one that you really want to stay away from if you possibly can. The others, stay away from them anyway, but if it's expanded polystyrene or it's polyvinyl chloride, walk away fast.
Okay, great. So interesting questions on research on organisms that might be able to sort of consume and detoxify plastics, whether there's fungi or.
There is all sorts of interesting research that's going on, and it maybe someday we'll find something that's a miracle out there, but really the most important thing is that we need to stop producing so much of it. So we need to, as Megan had in her photo, turn off the tap. So the real solution is we just need to stop producing and then using so much plastic. I don't know of anything miracle that has been found yet. Megan or Colleen might have some more, but really we just need to turn off the tap and stop making so much plastic.
Agree.
I do actually have a little bit of insight into that one, which is that the idea of enzymes that can break down plastics comes from stuff we find in nature that's able to break down, like leaves that seem to have a waxy film, or the shells of various insects. But in order to scale those kinds of enzymes and have them work on the diversity of plastics that we have, and then still deal with the plasticizing additives, you are decades and decades and decades out from where we are. So it's very, very niche right now, and it will be for decades, pretty much no matter what.
Okay. Okay, so here's a question for all the presenters about the use of plastics as feedstock for fuel. And can you comment on sort of the pluses and minuses of using feedstocks for plastics?
I can jump in here unless somebody else wants to take it. It's not a good idea. So it's basically using fossil fuels. So almost all plastic is made from fossil fuels. So it's extracted from the ground, whether that's an oil or as gas, and then refined and turned into chemicals and petrochemicals that are then created plastic. So it's basically then burning those fossil fuels. If you're turning it into fuel, it's a fossil fuel that then may have lived as a plastic packaging or in some other plastic form, and now you're burning it. So if we're gonna address the plastic crisis and the climate crisis, we need to do both things. It doesn't make any sense to use plastic as a feedstock, even if you've refined it down to some of its chemical components and you're burning that. It's just not a good solution. And there's one other point on the connection between the plastics crisis and the climate crisis is really close, in that because all plastics is made from fossil fuels, it is leading to the increase in fossil fuel and greenhouse gases. So that if you put all the greenhouse gas emissions from plastics, from extraction to production to use and disposal, plastics would be the fourth or fifth largest producer of greenhouse gases. That's in comparison to other countries too. We were just looking at this, and I think it's bumped up potentially to fourth. It used to be the fifth largest emitter, and it might be fourth now. So plastics is a big climate problem, and burning plastics for fuel is not a good solution.
Thank you. And I think that sort of speaks to another attendee asked about climate change. So I see several questions about PVC in pipes, which, we're sort of in place of leaded pipes. So we're sort of exchanging one risk for another, but some questions about are there any other alternatives to that? Is there any way to sort of eliminate in your water supply PVC that leaches?
Yeah, we did a study on this at Beyond Plastics, and we did find that yes, there is chemical leaching from from PVC pipes. So it is, one harm for another. It's a swap out. I think we could call it a regrettable substitution. Copper pipes, particularly if it's recycled copper, are absolutely a good solution, good alternative. Stainless steel, also a good alternative.
Okay, great. So another question, what about the sort of incineration of plastics and how that sort of factors into, communities of color that might be more likely to be exposed to waste incinerators and impacts on health in that way?
Yes, that's a problem. So plastic is a big environmental justice problem, both basically at all stages of its life cycle, from the extraction to the production facilities are often in environmental justice communities. So that could be low-income communities, communities of colors, where they're right up against the fence line of those facilities, as well as in the disposal facilities, and that includes incinerators. We also ship a lot of our plastic waste to other countries where it could potentially be burned too, which is, just expands that problem to not only a national issue around environmental justice, but also a global issue on environmental justice.
Thank you.
Yeah. When you incinerate plastic, you're basically turning plastic pollution into air pollution. And one of the biggest hazards are dioxins, which are created when you do that. And they are highly carcinogenic and rain down on the fence line communities, but then also on everybody else.
Yes, agreed. Okay, and then a question on bioplastics. Are there any, which I'm not familiar with, are there any health concerns related to bioplastics use?
Unfortunately, it's pretty much all the same health concerns. In order, again, to turn a sugar, like a radish sugar or beet sugar, into a plastic, you need the same suite of chemicals. So you have the same chemical input. There are some standards, but the standards don't really come up to snuff when you start looking at the whole range. So you wind up with the same plastic leaching, and if they're compostable, if they're designed to break down, then you wind up with all of those chemicals now in your compost as well. So, it's kind of a cat in the hat, like ring around the bathtub. You just keep moving that ring, no matter where you put it.
Got it. Okay. There's an interesting question on captured industrial emissions conversion to feedstock chemicals that are made into plastic. Is the chemical footprint or asphyxiant risk greater than the proposed benefit of capturing those emissions?
I'm not sure what that's referring to, except maybe carbon capture itself, which is about more than just plastic, but I'm confused. Christy or Colleen,
Maybe that person who asked the question could sort of clarify it, and then we'll go on to another one. The use of styrofoam cups, is there a difference between using it with cold and hot beverages?
Yeah, there is. The hotter the beverage, the more leaching you're going to get. So, for instance, if you have something like a hot cup of tea or coffee, the heat is pulling out chemicals, but then the acid is also causing more migration. And then you add a little bit of milk and you have lipids there, which are, most of these chemicals are lipophilic, meaning they're attracted. So you have kind of a perfect storm when you put a hot beverage into a polystyrene cup.
Okay, thank you. There's some interesting comments. I would encourage people to look at some suggestions and websites on here as I'm going through. Okay, so the participant who asked about the capturing says, yes, carbon capture to a feedstock chemicals that are made into plastics with a bioaccelerant. The University of Toronto is among the research institutions that are developing studies. There.
I know.
Okay, okay. I'm sorry, Adriana, that we weren't able to answer that, but maybe we can potentially come back. I think we've hit most of the questions. One we missed was on microwaving. I think you mentioned that already, Megan, but is microwaving with a plastic cover that's not touching the food, is that hazardous?
That's a good question. I get asked that a lot. That's not. Think about it in terms of food contact materials. If it's making contact with the food, that's trouble. But if it's not directly hazardous to the food.
Okay, great. Okay, we only have like a minute or two left. So if thank you so much for all the questions and for the responses. And if any of the presenters or all of you have, one kind of final take home point that you'd like to share with our audience, that'd be awesome.
Final take home points. I find that I like to people ask me a lot, how do you do this every day? Because, oh my God, it's so upsetting. And I find that if I turn my anger, I let it harden into resolve rather than despair, but resolve. And I use that to really motivate myself. And also, to let it sink into the point, I understand the chemical migration. You know what? I'm going to pay a little bit more for a different form of packaging. I'm going to push harder at the polls and calling, elected leaders and so on. I let it fuel me rather than frighten me.
Fantastic. Great piece of advice. Colleen, just calling you next if you have one.
Sure. Yeah, one other takeaway, again, as Megan was saying, it can get a little daunting dealing with these types of issues. I would just encourage everyone to try to make one small change at a time, whether it's not using whether it's not using single-use plastics and getting a reusable water bottle, if you change one thing at a time, that's great.
Fantastic. And then last but not least, Christy.
I'll add to that, using our collective voice. So really what we need companies to change, and they're not doing it quickly on their own. And that's why it's so important to make sure you're mayors, your city councilors, your state legislators, your members of Congress, your senators hear from you that you're concerned about these issues and that you want change. So pick up the phone, make a call, let them know what you want, stop by their offices.
Absolutely. Okay, thank you. I guess I'll put a plug in for talking to your health worker about any concerns that you might have on plastics in your health. Always a good idea. Tim, do you have any final words for closing?
Yeah, well, I want to thank everyone for joining, and Christy and Colleen and Megan and Maria for hosting this webinar. I guess my final plug would be it's really going to take mandates because we are headed in the wrong direction. But tying it back to artificial turf, which Peer works on, we know in many local communities, people are stepping up at the local level and demanding change. So hopefully this webinar itself provided all of you on the webinar with some useful information that you can use for your own advocacy, for your own education, and for your own personal choices. We didn't get to answer a lot of the questions, but we will be sending a follow-up email with a video recording, and hopefully we can comb through the questions. And if we missed any, we'll answer them in the email, and we'll provide web addresses for some of the sites that were mentioned by the presenters. So thank you again, everyone, and have a wonderful day. Bye.